Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the global oil wars. Our guest, Brian Becker, National Director of the Answer Coalition. Brian Becker, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Brian, on October the 14th, on an editorial in the New York Times titled A Pump War, Thomas Friedman wrote, and I quote, "Is it just my imagination, or is there a global oil war underway pitting the United States and Saudi Arabia on one side against Russia and Iran on the other?" Was he right?
There is an oil war. There's always some degree of oil war because it's a capitalist world oil market, and so there's competition. We see principally in the case of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi decision makers have cut the price of crude oil specifically to the U.S. market in the recent time, since in the last few weeks. That's their second big discount. This is good for the U.S. economy. It's good for U.S. consumers. It's being buffeted in some ways for the shale industry, the hydraulic fracturing industry.
The fracking.
Fracking. It's very bad for Venezuela. It's very bad for Russia. It's bad for Iran. It's particularly bad for Russia and Venezuela, which depends more greatly on oil revenues as a big part of their national budget. So we've seen a precipitous decline in oil prices. But is it just a manipulation? I think there's more to it than just manipulation.
Like what?
We see a decline in demand in the case of both China and Europe. Europe is entering a recession. We see very big increases in oil production, especially from the fracking industry in the United States and perhaps elsewhere. So I don't think this is simply a political manipulation by the United States and Saudi Arabia, which of course both would like to weaken Russia, weaken Venezuela, weaken Iran for different reasons. But I think there is the element of market forces at play, and in particular where the Saudis have determined that a price discount, a drop in oil prices, is better than a drop in oil production from the point of view of their maintaining their own share of the world oil market, and particularly the U.S. oil market. So there are economic calculations that also play out as a form of war, not simply political calculations.
In a way, ISIS is playing a role in all this?
Well, maybe, but if you think that if the Islamic State and the tumultuous breaking apart of important countries, Iraq, a second largest oil producer in the Middle East, and Syria, not a big oil producer but an important country, you would think that just trouble or conflict or tension within the Middle East would lead to a soaring oil price. In other words, there would be a fear that demand would be cut. But that hasn't really happened. So I think that in addition to the conflict that's taking place in the Middle East, the destabilization of Iraq and Syria, of course the rise of the Islamic State, it is also countervailed more than it would have been, say, 2 decades ago, again because of increased oil production, particularly that from the United States industry, the domestic fracking industry.
In the particular case of ISIS, the ultimate goal behind eventually fighting ISIS inside Syria, do you believe that is the toppling of the government of Bashar al-Assad?
Well, there's two elements, both of which are running in parallel, and there's some contradictions in these two patterns. One is the United States government, even 14 months ago, was prepared to bomb the Syrian government, which was fighting the Islamic State. They never said a word about the Islamic State. They never said that they were a great danger.
Didn't exist.
Didn't exist. It wasn't on the radar. It was like we must destroy the Assad government because of its purported use of chemical weapons. 14 months later, the United States enters Syria in order to fight the Islamic State and says it won't, at least quietly says, it won't start to bomb Syrian armed forces. Now, what's going on here? One is the Islamic State's development as a political military force was, I believe, an unintended consequence of the U.S. policy of fracturing Syria. I don't think there was some sort of center of U.S. imperial domination that said, let's make the Islamic State grow. This grew because the United States fractured sovereign unitary countries, Iraq and Syria, and allowed them space to grow. But having allowed them to grow, creating the space that allowed them to grow, Islamic State does pose something of a strategic challenge to basic U.S. assets. Kurdistan in the northern part of Iraq, which is half of Iraq's oil, Jordan, which of course is considered a primary strategic asset, and of course Baghdad itself, where the U.S. still wants to exercise total domination. So I believe it's the unintended consequences of a U.S. policy, short-sighted, reckless, imperial, criminal policy to break up Iraq and Syria that's allowed the Islamic State to grow, and then becomes the pretext, and this is the bottom line, the pretext for what the U.S. policymakers have said will be endless war in Iraq and Syria now that we have the Islamic State as a menace. In other words, it is a menace, but it's also being used as a pretext by the United States to do what Bush and Cheney said they wanted to do 11 years ago, 12 years ago, which is create endless war in this region of the world where 2/3 of the world's oil is possessed.
Oil is the main issue here.
In the region, yes. That doesn't mean that there's a direct corollary at every moment between oil prices and possession of oil or access to oil and political military manipulations. Reality is more complex than that. But the United States would not have invaded Iraq in 2003 if it wasn't for oil. They would not have spent all of the assets that they have as the priority in the U.S. foreign policy, Israel, Egypt, Iraq, these areas, if it wasn't for oil. The reason the United States is there is because of oil. And the reason oil is important is not because the United States lacks access to oil, but control of oil means control, or at least having significant influence with all of the different players in the world economy, because the oil is the artery, the main, the nexus for industrial economies.
Lilia Kusyanova published an article saying that the opposition of Russia and Venezuela and Iran to the U.S. policies and the lack of fear to express of those countries their independent viewpoints is forcing the U.S. to, her words, resort to several options in order to undermine the economic stability of those three countries. In that sense, oil could be one of the weapons?
Well, of course. I mean, what's happening with the oil market, the precipitous decline from $100 plus per barrel to $75, and maybe going down lower to $65, that is far more impactful on Russia's economy, say, than the economic sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia following the decision by Crimea to affix itself to Russia, or the other events in southern and eastern Ukraine. The impact on Venezuela, very great. In the case, and of course, the United States really wants regime change in Venezuela, as it does in any independent nationalist government that tries to control its own labor, its own resources, its own boundaries.
Its own oil.
Its own oil. And of course, we know that historically, before the formation of OPEC, when Saudi Arabia and Venezuela partnered with the formation of OPEC, more than 50 years ago, the price of oil was determined in Texas. And that was very good for American consumers. We paid 39 cents a gallon for gasoline when I was a child, but for the producer countries, they lived in abject poverty. Only the 70s and the revolutionary nationalizations of oil allowed some of these societies to start to come up. The United States doesn't fail at all. If oil prices go way down, the producer countries fail. Of course, there is an oil producing industry in the United States. It too has interests. But I think big picture is it's very good for the American economy. You see, the American economy is going up right now, not for all reasons, mainly because of the diminution of oil prices.
Luis Bassett, from an article in the newspaper El País, a little bit what you were mentioning, they say, there are many ways to fight a war, his words. Not always shots are needed. A decision over the prices of gas and oil or a restriction on the supplies sometimes is enough to produce much more devastating effects than a bombing or an invasion.
Oh, certainly. And it has the advantage of no drama. When you bomb a country, when you send troops, when you occupy a country, it creates all sorts of political dissent and turmoil because you can see there lies a policy decision. Behind the scenes, economic pressures, which are quieter, silenter, which don't have the same drama, also have the ability to sort of pacify a public opinion at home. Americans aren't going to care if their oil prices drop except to be happy. If they're dropping the price of gasoline, that makes the American people happy. If they were to say, well, let's go to war against Russia or Venezuela or Iraq again, of course, the American people would be up in arms. So obviously, economic tools like the price of oil can be a major, powerful, impactful force, more devastating than war. Again, I would say the U.S. is keenly aware of what's going on, which doesn't mean that it's strictly an act of manipulation by policymakers to drive down the oil prices, even though that may be part of it.
The control of the oil and gas reserves of the world is critical for the superpowers?
Oh, definitely superpower. I mean, World War II would have, the players in World War II would have been completely different. The alliances would have been different, except for how they all aligned around the control and access to petroleum products. The United States made sure that while Japan and Germany after World War II revived, they did not have their own independent oil. That made them a dependency. So the question of access and control over oil is really the question of independence.
Do you believe that the change in prices or lowering the prices of oil is going to last for a long time?
Ultimately, it cannot last for a long time. Ultimately, because oil is still a principal commodity, a very important strategic commodity, and because it's useful and utilized by all industrial countries in the world, and that's a bigger and bigger part of the world population, the issues of supply and demand cannot be strictly manipulated for a long term. There can be momentary manipulations, but they can't last for a long term.
And in the case of the countries in South America, we're talking about Venezuela, we're talking Bolivia, we're talking Ecuador, we're talking Argentina with gas and oil reserves. The fact that they regain or gain for the first time control over their natural resources, do you think that is a real motive for the U.S. to launch a quote-unquote economic war against them?
I think it's definitely part of the military and political or intelligence calculations. Certainly that's part of it. The United States has been very aware that it did not want developing countries that had independent governments. If they had monarchies that were tied to the CIA, that was one thing. But if they were independent nationalist governments, the United States was keenly aware that the control over strategic assets would allow those countries to be more fully independent. Let's never forget that Mohammad Mossadegh from Iran was overthrown, democratically elected prime minister in 1953, and replaced by the Shah of Iran, a tyrant. Why? Because he dared nationalize what was then called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now known as British Petroleum. In other words, that act was considered hostile to corporate interests, but also a way for Iran to emerge as an independent state. And once the people rose up, after 26 years of tyranny, dictatorship, horrible torture by anyone who was a political dissident, 26 years of that, the Iranian people rose up and overthrew the tyrant, a king, imposed by a foreign power, by the intelligence agencies of a foreign power. And what was the response of the United States and Britain? To impose economic sanctions on them, diplomatic isolation. And since that date, in February 1979, the United States government has had no diplomatic relations whatsoever with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why? Not because they were less democratic than the Shah. The Shah is the worst tyrant of all, but because they were an independent government that controlled their own oil and used that oil to lift Iran up.
We have seen that the fracking industry is booming. And we have seen in these past midterm elections an incredible increase of donations of that industry to congressmen in Washington. We're talking about 213%. And the next majority leader, Mitch McConnell, he received from the industry directly, that is documented, $370,000, and on top of that, from other organizations. Is there a direct relationship between national policy and the donations, quote unquote, of the different players in the industry?
The American Congress, those in Senate like Mitch McConnell, those in the House of Representatives, you could compare them to puppets on a string. And those puppeteers, those holding the strings, are the big corporations in America. Who are they really? The biggest banks, the biggest oil companies, and the biggest war contractors. That's the trilogy. That's the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost of American business. And they're all intertangled. They see oil as a strategic asset and as a military instrument. But the politicians in Washington are truly, truly bought and paid for. This midterm election, $4 billion just to elect Congress people. This wasn't even a presidential race. $4 billion. Where does that money come from? From the same corporations.
The more expensive midterm election in history.
By far. And this is the whole trend. I mean, you can't have a plutocracy and a democracy. It's one or the other. The rule by wealth, the rule of the rich, the rule by the corporate establishment. When corporations receive personhood by the Supreme Court and can donate endlessly and in secret hundreds of millions of dollars to the same politicians who then go in and direct policy and say, yeah, we're going to represent our constituents. Well, who are the real constituents?
So is there the U.S. a democracy?
The United States is a plutocracy. I mean, of, by, and for the people. None of the American people actually believe that. Nobody actually believes it, except maybe people who are teaching our children in our social studies classes. Everyone knows that Congress is, I mean, there's a reason Congress has less than 10% approval rating. These are bought and paid for politicians. Nobody believes them, nobody trusts them. They know that they're just bribed agents. In other countries, we would call this corruption. In America, we call it the American political system and lobbying.
Where is the mass media? Why the general public is not necessarily aware, or these issues are not being brought up front on a regular basis so that the American people could have a clear knowledge of the way it's been handling?
You know, there's an old expression, this America has a free press. Anybody who's rich enough to own a newspaper can have freedom of press. And that's the reality in the United States. The corporate media, very, very small, tiny of corporations that are interlocked with the defense contractors and with the banks and with the oil companies, they control the American mass media. Now, the American people are cynical and suspicious, but they're not mobilized because the U.S. media functions basically as an echo chamber for corporate America and for the political elites, and it just feeds out 24/7 the same message saying all is well, all is great, the corporations are doing a good job, the politicians are wonderful. Once in a while there's a story of a scandal, but it's treated as an anomaly. So in the American media is the tightest controlled media in the world. I can go on RT or Russian TV or Venezuelan TV where they have dialogue and differences of opinion. Anybody with a progressive point of view is barred from the American mass media.
But in a very subtle way.
Very subtle way, but you know, up until 15 years ago, we were regularly on CNN, MSNBC, CBS. Those things happened to a small degree. And since the beginning of the Iraq War and after September 11th, the progressive voices are drowned out. We have been replaced 100% with Wall Street analysts or retired generals or retired admirals who are now the observers, the critics, the pundits, the people who set the political agenda.
So 9/11 was a turning point.
9/11 was a turning point, and then the Bush administration, generally speaking, was a turning point, because I think the Bush administration sort of took control with the mass media as they drove the country to one war after another, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., Libya finally under Obama. As the country goes to war, you need to make sure the public opinion isn't too aroused. And so that's the role of the mass media, to get out the line.
Louis Lapham, for a long time the publisher of the Harper's magazine, was interviewed once in BBC, and he says that after World War II, the wars were an essential and a key part of the American economy, that they were needing to keep fighting wars in order to have a healthy economy. Right or wrong?
Definitely right. I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address on his last speech at the end in 1960, said to the American people, beware that there's a menace to democracy, and that's the growth of a permanent military-industrial complex. He actually called it a military-industrial congressional complex, but they took out Congress for political purposes. And since that time, since the Korean War, really, because after World War II, the United States went back into recession. People don't know that. So the Korean War started in 1950. A permanent war industry was developed. And since then, for the last 60 years, 60 plus years, the United States military-industrial complex has been a mainstay of the U.S. economy. It doesn't mean it's 50% or 30%, but it's always there. And so no matter what happens, no matter what the competition is like, U.S. companies produce weapons, American taxpayers pay for them, those weapons are used in wars, those weapons are destroyed, those weapons are replaced. It's a constant cycle to stimulate the economy, which, as we could see from the 1930s, left to its own devices, crashes into depression.
So wars is a big business.
The ABCs of U.S. military policy is business. The ABCs of U.S. military policy is that this is a form of corporate welfare, a form of corporate subsidy by the richest government in the world, paid for by American taxpayers, to give their tax dollars to the defense contractors. Now, if you look around the country, you'll see nurses are being laid off, firehouses are being closed, schools. Policemen. Why? No money. But when it comes to the defense industry, it's a constant, limitless amount of funds. And when they start a new war, they can say, well, we won't even include it in the defense budget. It's off budget. In other words, let's spend $1 trillion on Iraq and not include that, as they didn't include in the regular budget. They just spent that money.
Where's China in all this panorama?
Well, China has emerged, trying to have, as they call it, a peaceful rise from an underdeveloped to a mid-level developed and finally a developed country. And it's still developing, even though its aggregate economic indices show that it's the second or even the greatest economic power. China's still got a lot of underdevelopment, as did all the other countries that suffered the legacy of colonialism or semi-colonialism. But as China has grown, it has created an alternative economic sort of source or model, not a model, but an economic source for countries that want to be independent. In other words, they can develop aid and assistance and trade relationships with China that are outside of the old networks of European and American colonial domination. And so in that way, the United States views China as a strategic competitor. Even though China wants peace with the United States and wants mainly just to be left alone, the United States continually puts the pressure on China. When President Obama went to Australia and said, we're announcing the Asia pivot, that was really to send a greater part of the U.S. Navy during the next 10 to 15 years into the Pacific. Why? To contain China. In other words, to counter China's influence, not only with North Korea, its traditional allies, but with South Korea, with Japan, with the Philippines, and with Vietnam. So the United States is actually contributing, fomenting a tension and near-war situations over disputed islands and territorially disputed waters between China and some of these third Asian countries, and the United States is trying to build a new anti-China alliance in Asia.
So China is more an economic threat than a military threat?
The United States wants hegemony. They want complete hegemony. When the Soviet Union existed and the socialist bloc existed, the United States carried out nonstop war against the Soviet Union. Not because the Soviet Union was going to invade Europe, but because it countered United States hegemony in other parts of the world. Now China independently, and to some extent Russia again, as it rises after its 2 decades of being on its knees, makes a threat for the United States, not because it's threatening, but because it remains an obstacle to complete world domination by the United States.
How you read the situation in Ukraine?
In the United States State Department orchestrated the overthrow of a democratically elected government, the government of Yanukovych, one day after it signed an agreement to limit presidential power and make major concessions to protesters who were pro-West, and that was only half the country. After he did that, the United States allowed fascists, they really are fascist and Nazi militias, to storm the parliament building, send Yanukovych running, take the seat of government, install 5 of the 11 cabinet members in that first government who were Nazis or neo-Nazis, and have the Obama administration declare this a great day for Ukraine.
For democracy.
Yeah, for democracy. What was that? That was an attempt, and I think a successful attempt in some ways, although Russia's fighting it, to take Russia's historic ally, the second biggest country within the Soviet Union after Russia, Ukraine, and bring it directly into an American sphere of influence and directly into NATO, contrary to all of the promises made to the Russian leadership in 1991 when the Cold War was officially proclaimed over, that they would not absorb Eastern and Central Europe, the former Russian allies, into an American military alliance. They did that step after step, country after country, but now the big prize was Ukraine. The United States did this, they created the crisis, and it was inevitable that the Russian government, led by Putin or anyone, would have to take countermeasures, especially given the fact that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is in Crimea, and big parts of the Ukrainian population have historic, cultural, and linguistic ties to Russia.
And oil or gas has something to do in that region?
A big part of it, because the Yanukovych government, which wanted to have friendly relations with the EU, but not accept their austerity measures, also wanted to have friendly relations with Russia and some of the other former Soviet republics. In other words, not to be in one camp or the other. But this is an area where there will be big natural gas pipelines going directly from Russia and from the Caspian, from Azerbaijan and the other Caspian Sea nations into Europe. So control over that oil pipe, that natural gas pipeline, is of strategic significance, yes.
So when you watch the news media in the US, you're getting exactly the opposite version, that Russia is the invader, that Russia doesn't respect, so the systematic bashing of Russia.
Yes, I mean, the American people are the most misinformed, uninformed population in the world, I think, because they have this media 24/7, very flashy, very great production qualities, but giving the same message, and a completely false message.
Brian Baker, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.